you ever paused to reflect on the moments that shape our faith and beliefs? I'm Danny, and in this podcast, Countryside Christian, we embark on a journey together to explore the raw and personal path to faith. We often see the finished product of faith, perhaps a manager of a church ministry, or someone standing in a pulpit. But we rarely talk about the messy middle, or we see the harvest, but rarely talk about the tilling of the soil. We ignore the challenges, the discoveries, and the profound loneliness that often accompanies the start of a spiritual walk. This podcast is for those who are currently starting that journey, or even questioning where you are. By pulling back the curtain on what it actually feels like to step into a church for the first time, or wrestle with an ancient text in a modern world. At the beginning of each podcast, I will pray for what is on my mind and this podcast.
When people first open the Bible, it can feel completely overwhelming. You are met with the arts, the hath, and the doeth, and that is only one translation. So far, we have covered the beginning of our journey, taking that first step, and then journeying inwards to look at our own untilled fields. This episode, we look at the manual itself, or as everyone else knows it, the Bible. It is the best-selling book of all time, printed in various languages and versions. For a newcomer, it can feel like being handed the technical manual for a complex piece of machinery without being shown how to read the diagrams. That is why today we're going to start decoding it. We are going to strip the threads of the jargon and find the plain English hidden in the soil. Let us put down our manuals and pray. Lord, I thank you for the inspired words you have provided, the history, prophecy, poems, songs, law, and gospel. May the letters of your word guide our journey towards you and into ourselves. Lord, I admit that when I read your book, I don't always understand the code, but I ask for the wisdom and the humility to seek help. I know there is so much to be learnt within these pages. I am sorry for the times I ignore your instructions, because my life becomes too busy and my fields too crowded. May our journey into your word be a fruitful one, as we try to understand what you are telling us. Give us the ability to interpret your message and expand our view of the world. And as we seek the right words to speak, we join together in prayer that Jesus himself taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen. There is a prime example of the code in action when we hear the Lord's Prayer. I grew up with the traditional version and never realised it had modernised until I walked into Holy Trinity for the first time. Many of us grew up with the diluted children's version. I received my first Bible when I was christened, a book full of stories I never questioned. Growing up in the 90s, I heard these tales in primary school, RE, in assembly, or during the annual nativity. I had them at church, at home, and at school. Sometimes these stories lifted my spirits and built my resilience. Other times I felt, oh no, not this again, mentally. Children get bored easily, but as an adult, you realise that you keep returning to these pages because you constantly learn more. Coming back to the manual as an adult, I've experienced the Mandela effect. Take the story of Moses. As a child, I was certain he was a solo operator. When I read it now, I see Aaron was there too. After I was confirmed in my faith at St. Mary's in Sutton, by the way, just to let you know, that's a different St. Mary's. There's about 3 in the area I lived in at the time. I decided to start reading the Bible for myself. I was determined to read it all. I can admit now that it did not go well. I trundled through Genesis only to give up after Numbers, which is only 18.4% of the total book. I had pushed through the Torah, a mix of theological history, law, and covenant documents. It sounds heavy, doesn't it? Well, that is exactly how my brain felt by the end. I had stalled the engine. This time, when I returned to faith, I didn't rush back in. I eased myself in. I listened to the stories in church and asked for guidance on where to start. I began with the Gospel of John. Now, I can hear you saying, that isn't the beginning. But that is the best thing about our manual, is that you don't have to start at page 1. Jesus is the centre, the beginning and the end. Think about it. If you meet someone new, you don't immediately demand to know their life story from birth. That would be weird. As British people, we ask their name, comment on the weather, or ask what they're growing in the local fields. We start with the person in front of us. That is exactly what reading the Gospels allows us to do. It is a humbling thing to admit you have stalled. I was determined to plough through the entire manual on my own, but by the time I hit the heavy soil of Numbers, I realised I was just spinning my wheels. I had the book in my hands, but I didn't have the code. I was like a manager who had the keys to the heavy machinery, but couldn't find the ignition. I have learnt that there is no shame in admitting you are lost in the diagrams. In fact, that is exactly where the magic in the dirt begins. When we stop pretending that we know it all and look for a guide. This brings us to the moment in the book of Acts. We find a man in a carriage doing exactly what I did. He is reading the ancient words, but he is brave enough to admit he is stuck. Let's listen to this encounter from the New Living Translation, which I believe captures the heart of every newcomer's struggle. Philip ran over and heard the man reading from the prophet Isaiah. Philip asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" The man replied, "How can I, unless someone instructs me?" And he urged Philip to come up into the carriage and sit with him. I love the honesty in that reply. How can I, unless someone instructs me? The man in that carriage wasn't stupid. He was just looking at a technical manual without a trainer. He didn't try to fake it or pretend that he had all the answers. He stopped the carriage, invited someone in, and admitted he was stuck. I have learned that we often treat the Bible like a piece of heavy machinery that we should just know how to drive instinctively. We feel like hypocrites if we have to ask what a certain lever or word does. But even here, in the manual itself, we see that it's okay to pull over and ask for an instructor. Whether it is a manager at church, a study group, or a plain English translation like the NLT, we weren't meant to break the code in isolation. We were meant to learn the controls together, sitting in the cab and figuring out the diagrams as a team. In this translation, we see Philip running up to a carriage to help a man who was brave enough to admit he was stuck in the text. I have learnt that there is no shame in admitting you do not have the code to unlock every chapter. In fact, it is the first step toward a true daily understanding. To help us strip back the jargon and the technical threads that often keep people away, I am joined by Adrian, who manages the workshop at Holy Trinity. Thank you for joining me.
Welcome, Danny.
I've described the Bible as a technical piece of machinery. It is a bestseller, but it is often the most unread book on the shelf because people feels it's overwhelming. In your own experience, what is the code that people are most afraid of, that they won't be able to break when they first open it?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that, Danny, to be fair. I think you're right. People can pick it up and get overwhelmed with it. I think for me, it's helpful to know it's a book telling God's story. That's what it's about primarily, and Jesus is the key. He is the key. He's the interpretive key. So I think people can come unstuck if they just dip into it. I think you've done that, haven't you? You just pick it up, you find yourself in like Leviticus or Numbers, and it's like, mate, what is this about? And it just becomes overwhelming. It's kind of just beyond what you can expect, isn't it? So it's helpful to just helpful to know it's a story about how God has interacted with people through history. It's his story, and it's pointing us to Jesus. So just on that level, I think that will help. So for me, someone new to the Bible, I would say, well, just read about Jesus.
Yeah,
pick a gospel. Just start there. Find as much as you can about him to begin with.
That's definitely a very interesting perspective. When we talk about, there are a lot of people nowadays picking up the Bible for the first time. What was your perspective when you first picked up a Bible?
So what to remember, if I'm honest. I mean, I became Christian when I was 24, and it was in an Anglican church, going through charismatic renewal, and I kind of experienced the reality of God. And I think from that point, I never kind of questioned that the Bible was God's word, and that the Bible was just like true. I know we've got to interpret it, and we've got to wrestle with it, and some things are hard. So I started from that perspective, and yeah, if it's God's word, I want to know about it. I want to read it. I want to find out what it says. I want to understand how it can change my life. Now I've got this faith that, oh my word, God's real. Therefore, yeah, I guess, and I can't quite remember. I'm sure I was told that the Bible's God's word and we should believe it. I can't quite remember when that happened. But as early as I can remember, I just assumed that it was God's word. It was relevant to my life. And therefore, I've got to find as much out as I can about it by reading it and also eventually studying it and that sort of thing.
As you mentioned, we should start with John, and that's one of the things that I learned very later on in life. When I first started reading the Bible, I trundled through Genesis and got bogged down in the genealogies. It felt like a mix of biology and history. But like you said, when you start with something like the Gospels, you are actually meeting the person that we are aiming to model our lives on. And how do you suggest a newcomer recalibrates their reading plan, thinking about the Gospels as a starting point?
I've always had a particular reading plan which rotates around different books of the Bible. So I'll read a Gospel, then I'll read a bit in the letters or the New Testament further along. Then I'll read a bit of the Old Testament. So I've got a plan that helps me do that. So I don't stick to it religiously, because there's times where I'll think, actually, no, I just want to concentrate on, I don't know, the Psalms or something. Well, that's what I try and do. And I would say, come to the Bible humbly. There's going to be things that we'll read that we just don't understand, and that's okay. That's inevitable. So it's okay to park those bits and say, look, I don't understand that at the moment. Hopefully I'll meet someone like Danny Grins and he'll explain it to me. But at the moment, I don't understand it, and it's okay. I think a lot of people, they'll read it and say, oh, I just don't understand that. I'm going to give up with this. But I think we just need to be a bit more humble about it and just say, look, over time, I'm going to probably understand more and more as my faith increases, as God reveals more about his word to me.
Just thinking about how God reveals himself. A lot of the time when we first pick up the Bible, sometimes it can be some people call it churchy language. The jargon I call the technical threads. As a vicar, how do you ensure the service of the church remains accessible? How do we stop the language of the Bible from feeling like a barrier to someone who has never heard a parable before?
I think modern translations are good. There's different translations, but equally, I don't think we should be afraid of the language. There's I hear some things about we shouldn't use like even the word sin, and in one sense it is a bit of an old-fashioned word, but it's a biblical word. What I mean? So I don't think we should be afraid of the language of the Bible. But equally, there are things we can do to help us understand it. So Bible versions that are in plain English, in modern English, I think are good and helpful to us. So I'd always recommend, certainly someone new to the Bible, get a translation that you can read. That the language is helpful.
With myself, I picked the New Living Translation over the Message, just down to the fact that the Message sometimes is a little bit cut off on where the numbers are as regards to when I'm reading through certain chapters. But this is something like the New Living Translation, which sticks out very similar to the NIV, New International Version. But we've also then kind of going back to what I actually grew up with, which was the King James Version. And one of the things that I utilised during some of my own testimony is the fact of me growing up with this and how it impacted sometimes maybe that kind of reluctance of stepping away. Do you think that there's any Bible that's very similar to King James which may kind of put people off a little bit, or do you think we've got a good array now?
I know some people really love the King James, don't they? I mean, there's a new King James Version which is trying to be faithful to what the King James Version was trying to do, but just in a more modern language. I personally think the King James Version isn't the best translation to use. I think it's better to use a more version with plainer English we understand better for sure. But I love the Message Bible, because the Bible was never written in chapters and verses. So actually to just have a chunk that we can just read, I quite like. And actually, it's done by a real scholar. The Message, the kind of the translation behind it is really good. So I quite like that. And what I do, especially if I want to study a bit, I'll read something like the NIV or New Living Translation, but I'll probably just read it again in the Message version.
Right. Okay.
Because often we'll read it in like the NIV and we'll think, I'm not quite sure what that's saying. Then we'll read it in the Message version. That's kind of what it was meaning. I had so many experiences using the Message Bible in that way. I'd recommend people at least have another translation, something like the NLT or the NIV, and something like the Message. I think it'd be quite useful.
I think this is one of the things that the different versions of the Bible produces different ways that people see the insight. And I very much do agree with you, the way that the Message kind of communicates the Gospels and the Bible overall to ourselves. I actually do have the audio version of the New Testament in the version of the Message. So I have to kind of listen to it in a block anyway. But when I'm actually doing reading, I tend to stick to New Living Translation, just so with me having dyslexia, I can kind of stop and kind of go, right, okay, I stopped there. That's where I need to pick up from. And it isn't too much for me sometimes, versus what my reading plan is now, which I use the U Bible app, I believe it is.
Yeah.
And I actually listen to it again, because sometimes reading it can take a lot out of me, whereas if I'm actually sitting listening, I can understand it more.
Yeah.
So
there's so many things out there that can help us now. You know, the internet's awash with kind of apps and reading guides, and I think one of the best things we can do, especially as we're starting out, is find someone to read it with.
Yes.
You know, can be just in your church, wherever. You know, can we read the Bible together? You know, it is a much richer, or it can be a richer experience. Just two people looking at a passage and in like, oh, what do you think this says? And how do you think this applies? That's a great thing to do, I would say. And I think as a church leader, I know I'm new to Trinity, but you know, I'll be recommending this at some point. You know, people do get together either just in twos or threes. And spend time just reading the Bible and simply studying it. We're all theologians, really. You know, and just ask some basic questions of it. You know, what is this saying to me? What does this mean to me? How can I apply this in my life? And doing that with someone else, I think, is a great idea. Really useful thing to do.
Thank you very much for that key piece of advice there, Adrian. So, in my testimony, I spoke about how Moses and Aaron, even a manager, needs a mentor. How does the church act as a leader for a newcomer? And is it okay for someone to admit they are stuck without feeling like a failure?
It's certainly okay to admit you're stuck. I'll admit I get stuck. It's not a failure. You know, the Lord, He wants to help us. You know, he says He leaves us with His Spirit to guide us into all truth. You know, He's really on our side. You know, and again, we can obviously read it just as a book, and many people do just as a book, but actually to read it in a way that actually points us to relationship with Jesus is to read it altogether differently, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of, you know, Lord, how are you pointing me to Jesus? And He will speak to us through it if we've got that mindset. You know, that it's not just a book. Actually, this is about relationship. This book is about relationship with Jesus. Lord, how are you speaking to me through this? And He will do that.
I would definitely say that I've experienced like one time where I was trundling through Job. I use that very, very lightly when I say that. And then one day my app just kind of kicked up and said, you need to read the book of James. It'll be a good idea as part of a reading plan for so many days.
Yeah.
And what I didn't realise at the time was until I'd finished the book of James and I was like near the end of Job, and I was just like, something seems very similar about these two. And I just literally just kind of was starting to think and like, right, okay, I need to get these thoughts out. And when you're on your own, I do have to use the infamous AI when I start talking to myself. So, and I said, there seems something very similar about Job and James. And this is what I'm thinking. Things like, obviously, there's a little bit of crossover around the theology behind it. And it just kicked out, you're actually quite right. There is a very good comparison here as the theology really kind of crosses over here. However, Job is this, which is a raw emotional reaction, whereas James is very based and heavy in the theology. And I was just like, that's probably what I was picking up on and what God was trying to tell me, you know, and then that makes you kind of reflect on your own kind of journey where you are at that time as well. Yeah. So I think I love
the book of Job. I love it. I've read it recently. That's part of my reading plan. I love it. It's a great book. Got so much to say about our life today. Great.
Definitely. To be honest, I really do agree with that, because especially when people are starting to chitter-chatter with each other and it's like, God, no. And it's just like, one of the things that I described my childhood as, even the fact that I was growing up in an age of the 90s, but it felt very much like the question was very much on people's lips, Jesus, who are you? And it was very kind of not really being answered. Whereas I found more recently that question is being answered and more people are coming through, whether it be by just picking up a Bible or finding different ways to listen. Obviously, we've got the access to the internet now with YouTube and everything, so people are finding ways to listen that way.
I keep on hearing that as well, Danny. I keep on hearing stories of people who wouldn't say they're Christians, but they're just saying, I just feel a bit compelled to read the Bible.
Mm.
And I think sales of the Bible have gone through the roof this last year, haven't they?
Yeah.
So I think there's more and more people just thinking, oh, yeah, I'm just searching for something, and maybe the answer's in this book. And you and I would say, well, yes, it is.
Yeah. I think one thing with the Bible, you can pick it up no amount of times and read it amount of times. It doesn't matter what you pick up. There's always something new to learn that God will show you. The best thing is on how historical within the Gospels it is as well, how very right for the time of when it was being recorded, which makes it a lot more compelling to go, actually, this feels right because of the way it's written and the way it's kind of talking about the times that we're about while they were traveling around.
Yeah. No, I'm going to say it's a crazy thing to think, isn't it? I always, the Bible's written across like 1,500 years, and I forget how many authors now, 60 odd authors, isn't it? And it all tells the same story. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it, that it does that?
Certainly does. Certainly does. I've probably lost the amount of times, even from doing the Bible course itself as well, even kind of like seeing the different ways it's assorted and everything and how you can move it about and work with it in different ways. But just kind of finally for the person listening who wants to start today, what is the daily check they can perform in the Bible that won't leave them feeling stupid or overwhelmed? How do we make sure that they stay in gear rather than stalling out?
The daily check. I'd go back to just read it with humility. Don't get too stressed out if it's not making sense. Tomorrow's another day. And just keep going. Make a plan. Read it. Make a time. Go to a place. And just read it, and keep reading it. It will start to make. If it's not making sense, it will start to make sense. If you're really struggling, find someone in your locality, a friend, someone who can read it with you. Persevere. Keep doing it. It will speak to you. I've heard too many stories where people say, "Oh, I was reading it and." People say like the words jumped off the page, the words were screaming at me, and if we read it with that openness of, Lord, would you speak to me through these words? He will. You will have those experiences. You'll also have dry times where you're thinking, oh, mate, I just got no idea what this is saying, or, do I have to read another like genealogy, and that's fine. If you go back to a gospel, go back to the reading about Jesus, and then once you've done that bit, then go to something a bit harder.
Oh, well, Adrian, I want to thank you very much for joining me in the workshop today and helping us strip back those technical threads. We've learned that while the Bible is the best-selling book of all time, it is meant to be operated, not just admired on the shelf. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Danny. Pleasure.
If you have been trundling through the difficult chapters and feeling stuck, remember Moses and Aaron. You do not have to be a solo operator. There is no shame in asking for a manager to help you interpret the diagrams. God didn't give us a code to keep us out. He gave us a manual to bring us in. This week, your daily check is a simple one. If you have been avoiding the Bible because it feels like hidden English, I want you to open the book of John. Don't worry about the genealogy or the ancient laws for now. Just focus on the person at the center of the story. Read just one chapter and ask for wisdom and humility to understand what it means for your life today. I'm Danny, the Countryside Christian. Keep your tools sharp, keep your heart open, and remember, the code is already broken. Let us get to work. See you in the next one.